Turkey has offered to sign readmission agreements with 14 countries. That's according to the Foreign Ministry spokesman. This move enables it to take back migrants rejected by the European Union more quickly. The EU agreed a $3.3 billion aid deal with Turkey to help it shelter refugees, mainly from the Syrian civil war. Will in return prevent them from travelling on to Europe. EU leaders want to see results before key talks with Turkey on March the 7th. Let's get more on this from Han Entzinger. He's a professor of migration and integration studies at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Many thanks for joining us, Professor. Now, Greece and Turkey are two countries that have, you could say, have taken the heaviest burden of this migrant crisis. Is the EU doing enough to help these two countries?
Well, it's understandable, of course, that Greece and Turkey do take a heavy burden because of their geographical location, and the EU, as you know, is helping them with money. The trouble is, however, that they promise a lot of money, but they don't always provide the money, actually, and many of the member states are not really willing to deliver and to keep the promises they make. And instead, they're putting up fences in order, to prevent migrants from traveling onwards into the rest of Europe. And that leads to the humanitarian crisis of which we've been seeing pictures at the Greek border. And it's my impression, actually, that by doing so, the EU tries to almost force Greece into improving its protection of the external border, which is the border between Greece and Turkey in the Aegean.
What's made things a lot worse recently is the situation of Western Balkan countries and Austria, who've now closed their borders to control immigration. Do you think their response has been fair?
Not really. It is perhaps understandable from their point of view because they don't know how to cope with it either. But from a humanitarian perspective, it's extremely unfair. And one of the big problems, actually, is that the European Union is unable to set up a fair distribution of all refugees over the 28 member states. The bulk of them goes to two countries only, which is Germany and Sweden. All the countries that they go through on their way fear that the migrants stay there. In many of the European countries also, there are growing anti-immigration parties, and the governments in those countries fear the power of those parties, and therefore they fence their countries off, thus frightening the population perhaps even more and reducing their willingness to accept the refugees.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you more about this polarization. What impact does it actually have on how refugees are, I don't know how to phrase this correctly. I mean, what impact does it actually having on refugees that go into these countries?
Yes, well, I think we can observe that in many places, not in all. I mean, there are many Europeans also who are very willing to accept and help refugees. But at the same time, there is also a substantial number of people in Europe who do not like the large numbers of refugees arriving, who are afraid of them. And the immediate impact of the lukewarm reception of refugees is that it harms their integration potential. We can assume that not all migrants who are arriving, but those who will be given refugee status, we can assume that those will stay in Europe for a substantial, number of years, if not forever. And it is in their interest, but also in the interest of the European countries, that their integration process starts as soon as possible, that they learn the language, that they find a job, they go to school, they find housing, and instead they're being put up in camps of very low and poor quality, and they're prevented from having contacts with the local population. And in the long run, there's enough research evidence also that shows that for previous previous refugee movements, in the long run, that is rather likely to harm their successes, their labor participation, and their integration as a whole.
Well, that's really interesting. Interesting to speak to you, Professor Han Entzinger, joining us from the University of Rotterdam. Many thanks.